Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me here. So I work, my work is predicated on the idea that any fundamental decision-making problem, there are multiple ways to solve it, and people differ from one another in how they solve such problems. So I study how exactly people differ from one another using behavioral experiments, both inside and outside the lab, and using neural and physiological measures such as MRI, MEG, EEG, pupillometry, heart rate. And, but most importantly, my approach to understanding the neural and the behavioral differences is computational. So understanding the algorithms that the brain implements to produce behavior. So I focus on differences between people at this algorithmic level. And I have multiple lines of work that follow this general scheme, but today I'm going to speak about one of them that relates to an interaction between the way that people learn about rewards and the way that their mood fluctuates. So we know quite a lot about the way that people and animals learn about rewards. This is a very simple one possible mathematical formulation of such a process. We know that there are processes that are driven by reward prediction errors. So in this example, the V is the expected reward, and R is the observed reward. And this learning process updates its expectations every time it observes the reward based on the difference between what it saw, what it got, and what it expected to get. So the reward prediction error. Now we know that these kind, or approximately these sort of prediction errors are signaled by the brain dopamine system, and we know that they are reflected in the bold responses in the ventral striatum. Which can be measured using functional MRI. Now we know quite a bit less about the way that mood fluctuates, but this is for one possible conceptual model of emotions and moods, but it's commonly accepted, it's almost true by definition, that getting more reward makes us happy, and getting less reward makes us less happy. A more nuanced understanding of this is that it's not the absolute value of the reward that we care about, but it's how much what we got is different from what we expected to get. So again, these reward prediction errors, these are what actually affect our mood, and there are all sorts of studies that are consistent with this view. However, if this was all there was to it, then we should have been able to have a much better insight into our own moods than we actually have. We should have been able to understand if we're happy or if we're sad, what is understanding what exactly is the reason for why we're happy and sad based on the rewards that we experienced or didn't experience recently. However, usually we have, I think that's different for different people, and we'll get into the individual differences part of it later, but many times we have very little insight about why we're happy and why we're sad. And for some people, mood can seem quite dissociated from the things that actually happen in their life. So this is one important problem that we may want to answer. Now, if there isn't a one-to-one mapping between reward prediction errors and mood, then we can also ask, well, what else is driving mood? What else is factoring into this process? And why is it that in some people, moods tend to escalate? So when they get into a certain mood, that mood tends to become more and more extreme. And why is it that in some people, moods tend to oscillate? So when they get good mood tends to follow bad mood, and bad mood tends to follow good mood, as for example happens in most clearly in bipolar disorder, but also in subclinical forms. And lastly, since we know these kind of mood fluctuations have a debilitating impact on people's lives, we can also ask, well, why do we have this system to begin with? Well, in what scenarios can mood have serve an adaptive function? By answering these three questions, we should be better able to distinguish between normal and pathological mood fluctuations. It should also help us to better diagnose and predict how mood fluctuations will evolve and potentially in the future also influence them. So in this talk, my goal is to give you one potential answer for each of these questions. So let's start with the first one. And here what I want to suggest is that it's possible that the effect of reward on our mood depends not only on the reward itself, not only on how surprising it is, but also on how sensitive to reward we happen to be at the time. So for example, if this is how mood would fluctuate of a particular person just based on the reward prediction errors that the person experiences, if the person is in a state of high reward sensitivity, then the same rewards will make them happier as compared when they are in a state of low reward sensitivity. So this idea of reward sensitivity is prevalent in the literature, but mostly in terms of individual differences. So it's thought that high reward sensitivity is a risk factor for bipolar disorder, low reward sensitivity is a risk factor for depression. But what I'm suggesting here is goes one step further. It's that perhaps reward sensitivity changes from day to day and brings it causes subsequent changes in mood. So in theory, if we can probe a person's sensitivity or responsivity to reward at a certain time point, we should be able to predict how the person's mood is going to fluctuate in the near future, at least a certain portion of the variance in the mood fluctuation.
Can I ask a
Yep.
simple question? Could you just give us your definition of mood and just to frame us on what exactly you mean by mood? Like, for example, is that just a conscious sense of the way I feel? Or could creatures that are less conscious than moods or...
So there's the only way that I know of to define mood is based on what either people report themselves or what other people report about them. So whether that person seems happy or seems unhappy. There are all sorts of other correlates of mood, levels of activity, sleeping patterns, physiological responses potentially. But these are not they don't really form part of the definition, at least yet.
So what I report about myself or others could report about me, and it's slow moving, slower moving.
Right.
It doesn't, like, I don't have a different mood at 9:10 a.m. than I did at 9:08 a.m.
Yeah. Right. So just in general, like it's accepted to the distinction between emotions and mood is that emotions tend to be specific reactions to a particular event, and they're short-lived, whereas moods can be more longer-lasting and not necessarily specific to one particular event that happen. All right, so to be able to test this kind of an hypothesis, I developed a mobile phone platform with which I can ask people to do certain tasks at certain points in the day using notifications. So the app can ask them to play a experimental game that I coded into the task, or to report their mood, or to log in life events or activities that may have impacted them, or answer personality questionnaire, do some motor tasks. It also tracks the number of steps that the subject takes during the day. But most importantly, interfaces with this chest strap that is a heart rate sensor, and with an EEG headband. It's a single channel EEG that I give to subjects, and I ask them to put on when they're doing certain tasks. So using this platform, I examined changes in people's moods and changes in people's responses to rewards over a period of 1 week in 10 subjects. And mood was assessed using this visual analog scale, and responses to reward were assessed using this experimental game, where on each game was composed of 72 trials, and on each trial, subjects simply have to choose between 2 images, and then say they pick the left one, they either don't get rewarded or they do get rewarded. And each image is associated with a fixed probability of reward, which subjects have to learn by trial and error. And they actually got a little bit of money for each reward that they collected. So this is the overall structure of the experiment. Subjects first came to the lab. We installed the app on their phone, gave them the sensors, make sure that everything works, have them play the game, 6 games in the lab, just to see that they understand everything. And then they played 2 games every morning and 2 games every evening. And they rated their mood 4 times a day. And each game here is composed of 72 trials, as I said before, and also importantly, it involves a different new set of images. So every time they need to learn about new images on every session throughout the week. And this is just to show you that people were able to learn which images are more likely to give them rewards. So here we see the progression throughout within a game. And you can see that by the end of the game, they came to choose the better image on 80% of the trials. So chance performance would be 50% here. But I was also interested in seeing, yes? 25%, 50%, and 75%. In each game, there were three images. And
No losses.
No loss, just 0. Yeah. And so I was also interested in seeing whether people retain this information over time. So on some trials, instead of having people choose between the new images, I had them choose between old images that they learned about in previous sessions. And interestingly, even 3 days after they learned about the images, they were still able to maintain very similar levels of performance. Now, this raises an important question, which is, well, do the choices here at the end of the learning, the short-term choices, do they reflect the same information as the choices that people are making several days later? And it turns out that
So just to clarify, so for the couple, sometimes you're giving them the same stimuli as you've seen before.
Yeah.
And so immediately you see the total, you don't see the learning, you just see kind of.
No, I don't even give them feedback on these trials, so they don't get any new information. So, yeah, that is, there's no curve here. Yep. Yep. There are different combinations. Yeah. So to to answer, so it turns out the answer to this question is no, and I found that out by fitting different computational models in terms of how well they can explain subject choices. And it turns out that if you use a single learning process such as this, that maintains an expectation for each image and updates it every time it observes an outcome after the image is chosen, then this learning process doesn't do a very good job in explaining subject choices both in the short term and the long term. What you have to include in the model to explain, reasonably explain subject choices is two simultaneous learning processes. One that has one that learns very quickly, but also forgets very quickly. So within half a day, all the information that this process learns completely disappears. And the other one learns very slowly, but also doesn't really forget over the course of the week. And actually, it seems like the information is a little bit amplified over time, which could suggest a process of consolidation taking place. So these two simultaneous learning processes means that we have two sets of expectations for each image and two sets of prediction errors every time an outcome is observed. So we can ask, well, do these prediction errors, are they reflected in people's physiological What is what? Well, it turns out that so I wanted to see whether there is any aspect of these processes that changes from session to session. And it turns out that that is the factor that changes, that best explain differences in how people behave between sessions, and that is just a scaling factor that scales you can think about it as the subjective value of reward. All right, so now, so I wanted to see whether these two sets of prediction errors are reflected in people's physiological responses. So there's just to give you a sense of how these look. This is the heart rate response for outcomes, for reward outcomes and no reward outcomes. You can see this is when the outcome comes up. And you can see that there's a difference in the heart rate several seconds later for this particular subject, and here again. So we can see that the response is somewhat sensitive to the actual outcome, but it's also sensitive to the expected outcome. So remember that each reward prediction error is composed of the actual outcome and the expected outcome. Here we're looking at the outcomes as a function of the true reward probability associated with the chosen image. And there's some modulation based on that probability. But if we look at a different subject, then we again see modulation by the actual expected outcome, but this time the timing and the shape and even the sign of the response looks a little bit different. So to be able to sum up the results across all subjects, accounting for these individual differences in the shaping and the timing, in the shape and the timing of the response, I had to use a more powerful method, and for that reason I used a standard machine learning method called support vector regression, which I used to decode the reward prediction errors from the physiological responses. So the way I did that was that I took all the physiological responses from either the heart rate or the EEG sensor, and all the reward prediction errors that were derived using the computational model from the behavior. And I trained the model 80% of the trials and then used it to decode the other 20% of the trials. Then I repeated this procedure 5 times, each time decoding a different 20% of the trials. So in the end, I decoded all the trials. And I measured the success of this decoding procedure by the correlation between the decoded prediction errors and the actual prediction errors. If there's no information in the physiological responses about the prediction errors, then this correlation should not be significantly different from 0. But as you can see here, I was able to successfully decode the prediction errors of either the fast process or the slow process from either the heart rate or the EEG responses. And moreover, the decoded prediction errors of the fast process and the slow process were actually not correlated with one another. So these were truly two distinct signals coming out of the physiological data. Yep.
What was it about the EEG change that you were figuring out? What? I mean, heart rate, I guess.
Yeah. So the EEG, the EEG is a single channel, so it's also a waveform that surrounds the outcome. I looked at half a second before the outcome and up until 1.5 seconds after the outcome. And I took this waveform and I did a time frequency decomposition looking at 8 different frequencies between 1 and 29. And I fed all of this matrix of values to the support vector regression, which selected different features of that, different aspects of that for each participant. So there wasn't any particular aspect that I can say that was informative in all subjects.
So it's kind of a power spectrum of the waveform over some time window.
Mm-hmm.
Plugged in.
Yeah. So, and remember that, yeah. When was what? Well, both of the processes were acting simultaneously, and they're always both learning and always both forgetting, but the fast process forgets very quickly, whereas the slow process doesn't. And each decision reflects a weighted combination of the information that is provided by both of these processes. Yeah. So it comes out a little bit different for different people. Usually there's like one process can be twice as important than the other process, but overall across the group it's quite balanced. All right, and remember that each reward prediction error is composed of the actual outcome and the expected outcome. So to see whether both elements are actually reflected in the physiological responses, we can try to decode each one of them separately. And it turns out that it is actually possible to do that in most cases, except this particular combination here. All right. So now that we have our physiological measure of responsivity to reward, we can test our hypothesis. Does the degree to which people respond to reward predict how their mood is going to fluctuate? So I assessed responsivity to reward using these physiological measures by simply computing the degree to which the reward prediction errors could be decoded from each particular session, the degree to which they are reflected in the physiological responses. And here, I'm showing you the data for one subject. In dark red, you see the degree to which the reward prediction errors of the fast process were evident in each session in the EEG signals. And in light purple, you see the way that the subject's mood fluctuates based on their self-report. And as you can see, there's a very close correspondence between these two measures, but the reward prediction errors decoding maybe slightly anticipates the changes in mood. However, if we look at the same subject at the slow process prediction error, this time, the mood trace is the same thing, the same mood trace because it's the same subject, but the slow process prediction error also corresponds quite closely with the mood changes, but this time there's a gap of about a little bit more than a day between the two measures. And if I sum up these results across both all subjects, then what I see is that if I look at the fast process prediction error decoding in a particular session, that predicts how mood is going to change in the next few hours, and that predictive power peaks at around 10 hours after the session. So greater evidence of reward prediction errors, mood improves. Weaker evidence of reward prediction errors, mood becomes worse. And if I look at the slow process prediction error signals, then these predict how mood is going to be approximately a day later. So their predictive power only starts to appear after the peak of the fast process prediction error predictive power. So these results suggest that indeed people's mood fluctuations are preceded by fluctuations in their responsivity to reward. And the next natural question to ask, well, so what is impacting this responsivity to reward? And one possible answer is that maybe in some people, it's actually mood itself that drives these changes in responsivity. So this example, think about, I'm going to give you an example. Maybe some of you are going to relate to it and some of you are going to think, no, I think for me it's actually the opposite. But that is exactly what I want to get at. But the example is just that, for example, just eating a piece of chocolate might feel more rewarding or like taste better when we are in a good mood than we're in a bad mood. But if that is true, then if mood actually impacts the way we respond to reward, then you can easily see the potential here for a positive feedback loop. So reward makes us happy. Being happy makes us respond more strongly to reward. And that makes subsequent reward make us even happier. And that further strengthens our response to reward and so on. And the same process of escalation can also happen in the negative direction with negative mood and low responsivity to reward. So this could be a mechanism that could give rise to emotional instability. So I first wanted to test in the lab whether I can actually see this impact of mood on reward, so on responses to reward. So for this purpose, I designed the following experiment that is composed of a reward learning game and then a mood manipulation part and then another reward learning game. And each game consists of 48 trials. On each, it's essentially the same task as what people played on the phone. So on each trial, you have to choose between two slot machines. Say you pick the left one, either you get a reward or you don't get a reward. And you have to learn by trial and error that this machine is more likely to give you a reward and this machine is less likely to give you a reward. And then comes the mood manipulation part. And in this part, I told subjects that they can win or lose any sum of up to $8. They only have one shot, and that $8, is quite a lot compared to how much they made for the experiment in total. But what they didn't know is that half of them were set up to win $7, and half of them were set up to lose $7. And then they had to play, they played another reward learning game where they had to learn anew about 3 different slot machines which had the same probability of rewards, but subjects didn't know that. They had to learn that through trial and error. So first of all, to see that the wheel of fortune the big rewards in the Wheel of Fortune draw actually impacted people's mood, I asked them to report how they feel 3 times during game 1 and 3 times during game 2 by choosing one of these frowning or smiling images. And as you can expect, people who won the Wheel of Fortune draw became happier during game 2, until people who lost the Wheel of Fortune draw became unhappy during game 2 compared to game 1. And now, I wanted to see whether the impact of mood in game 2 actually was associated with an impact on how people responded and learned about rewards during this game. So for this purpose, I asked people at the end of the experiment to choose between slot machines that they learned about in game 2 and slot machines that they learned about in game 1. And before looking at the results, we're going to divide subjects into high emotional instability group and low emotional instability group based on just a median split on the results of a self-report questionnaire that measures emotional instability traits. And looking at the high emotional instability group, I found exactly the expected result, which is that people who won the Wheel of Fortune draw, they were happy during game 2, so presumably they responded more strongly to those rewards and maybe learned more from those rewards. And they preferred the game 2 slot machines at the end of the experiment. And people who lost the Wheel of Fortune draw were unhappy during game 2, preferred the game 1 slot machines at the end of the experiment. And this, I didn't see this pattern at all in the low emotional instability group. Now, this resulted from 30 subjects doing the experiment outside the scanner. I repeated the experiment with 26 additional subjects in the fMRI scanner and got exactly the same result. Now,
is that first gray bar different than 0?
Is that what?
Is the first gray bar down on the high emotional instability different than 0? Is that? If you test it against 0, is it different?
I'm not sure.
It looks like it's not. And so just an injection.
It's definitely not different.
Were it not, then it makes the comparison to the other 2 bars, which are clearly not different than 0, indeterminate.
Right, right. I mean, this is definitely not more negative than this one.
Well, I mean, depends what you mean by that. Maybe at the trend level, barely, but then when you go over here, high emotional instability, I'd ask the same question about the first gray bar.
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't come out different than 0, it's hard to.
Yeah, as far as I can remember.
The story around it is so tight. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, as far as I can remember, the interaction is significant, but all the individual comparisons are either almost there or trend level or something like that.
And that's a numbers problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's a low numbers problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But conceptually, you can still say, well, maybe the bias at the end of the experiment might result from a completely different mechanism, not related to greater or weak or higher or lower responsivity to reward. Maybe it relates to some kind of a memory retrieval at this point that is somehow contaminated by the Wheel of Fortune draw. So to really see whether people respond more strongly to reward here or more weakly to reward, you can use the fMRI measurement. And specifically, we can take advantage of the fact that we know that the striatum receives reward prediction error signals from the dopamine system. So specifically, I looked at these areas of the striatum that responded more strongly to reward than to no reward in the experiment. And I compared this response to reward in game 2 to the response to reward in game 1. And looking at the at the high emotional instability group, I got the same pattern. So people who won the Wheel of Fortune draw, the response to reward tended to go up, and people who lost the Wheel of Fortune draw, the response to reward tended to go down. And again, I didn't see this result in the low emotional instability group. Again, the result here is in the interaction, not necessarily in the individual bars. But both of these results together suggest that indeed, in some people, those who tend to be emotionally unstable, reward doesn't only affect their mood, but mood also affects the way that they respond to reward. Now, if you want to understand how this two-way interaction, what are the consequences of this two-way interaction over longer time scales than what I just showed you in the lab experiment, then we need to form some kind of computational model of it. And one way to form such a computational model is to ask the question, what is this effect of mood? What can it be useful for? In what scenarios can it have an adaptive effect? Can it promote adaptive behavior? By doing that, I found out that we can explain this biasing effect of mood in very much the same way that we understand biases in the visual domain and in the motor domain, and that is as reflecting people's prior expectations. So to see that, consider the following scenario. Say we are this squirrel and we love fruits, and we come to this tree and we see 2 apples, and then we see 4 apples. Next time we see 3 apples, and so on. And we're faced with the problem of estimating how many apples can we expect to get from this tree on average. So a simple way to model this scenario is using a Bayesian model called a Kalman filter, where we assume that each observation is drawn from an underlying distribution whose mean changes following a random walk over time. And if we designate the mean of this distribution as V and the observed reward as R, then the optimal way to learn what is V is what is the average expected reward is by updating our previous estimates based every time that we observe a reward based on the reward prediction error. Now, if we have multiple sources of reward, then and each of them has a different reward rate, then what we have to do is just apply the same algorithm separately to each of these sources, and we can write that in short by using S to designate what source of reward we're talking about. However, what happens if sometimes, so usually these different sources of reward are independent, but sometimes there are global events that affect all of the sources of reward in the same way. So for example, let's say that the seasons change, and now all of the trees have more fruit. So in this case, the different sources of reward are no longer completely independent because we have these global factors that couple between them. And that means that when we are updating our expectation for a particular source of reward, we need to take into account outcomes that we observe not only for that source of reward, but also for other sources of reward. And one way to do that is to keep an estimate of a global momentum, so essentially telling us whether things are generally getting better or generally getting worse. And that can be computed as simply as a recency-weighted average of recent prediction errors that we observed across all sources of reward. And then we can use this global momentum estimate as a bonus whenever we're updating our expectation for a particular source of reward. So this global momentum inference of global momentum, this is what I propose that Mood is doing. And this quantity here, you can think about it as a mood-biased subjective reward. And we can take these two equations and we can plug them into a standard reinforcement learning model that makes choices based on its expectations and then updates these expectations based on the prediction errors, simply by assuming that the model has another variable, which is mood, and that mood is determined, reflects recent prediction errors, and it affects the way that reward is perceived, such that prediction errors are now computed with respect to this subjectively perceived reward that is biased by mood. And by doing that, I showed, first of all, that this model is better at explaining subject choices in the experiment, in the last experiment that we talked about, compared to this model, especially those subjects who tend to be emotionally unstable. Now, you can also use this model by fitting it to subject behavior. You can use it to infer what's the strength of the bias that mood exerts on perception of the reward for each individual. And as you can expect, this bias correlated with subject emotional instability traits based on the self-report questionnaire. You can also use the model to predict how mood is going to fluctuate based on the observed outcome, and that the model predicted mood was, in most subjects, positively correlated with the self-reported mood. And finally, remember that the bold responses in the stratum reflect reward prediction errors, and then so we can ask, do these responses reflect prediction errors that are computed with respect to the actual reward, as in the standard reinforcement learning framework, or with respect to the mood biased reward, right? And it turns out that subjects who show the effect of the mood bias on their behavior also show the effect of the mood bias on their striatal bold responses. So this model helps us explain the trial-to-trial pattern of bold responses in the vagal striatum better in those people.
Can I ask a question? These bold responses,
yep,
are uncorrected, but they're not corrected now, right?
That is a region of interest analysis. So here I'm just showing which region.
Before you said it was uncorrected, it said uncorrected.
Yeah, so it is uncorrected.
So I'm trying to get a feeling for what the striatal PE, what you're using as the proxy for the striatal response to mold.
Right.
You windowed in with an ROI based on another experiment or based on the data that you already have here?
So what I did was I looked at the areas of the stratum that respond to reward more than to no reward with a P uncorrected of 0.001. So that's how I defined the area.
You define the area with this task.
Yeah, but it's an orthogonal contrast to this test. It doesn't have anything to do with it.
But it is in the same context on the outcome. And this is on the outcome. These responses are the outcome. But I see what I'm talking. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're taking the peak amplitude at the outcome.
Right.
Okay. So some people would say you're double dipping. So you're using the task to define the ROI. You're using the task, which doesn't whole brain correct for it. I'm just going to tell you the kind of arguments I get.
Mm-hmm.
You're using the task to whole brain correct. Well, it doesn't quite whole brain correct. So you're going to use the task to now define ROI.
Uh-huh.
So you get a smaller volume, small volume correct.
Mm-hmm.
On multiple comparison problems. You're going to use that as the readout. You kind of already know the correlation.
Well, the question is whether what you're doing, are you creating a selection bias in your data that would affect
I'm just
your...
pointing this out. I'm not, it's not a strong thought.
Yeah.
I'm pointing that out that compelling. It doesn't look overwhelmingly compelling now. I mean, the data.
Mhm.
Do you think you could see this? Well, let me let you keep going. We'll do this in the question.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
But there was a little leisure de monde here where you started with uncorrected data, then all of a sudden I see this, and the next thing I know you picked an ROI using the paradigm that's causing the responses in the first place. If your claim is that, oh, this is representing the things that you want, then it ought to be responding to reward in other contexts. Maybe you could use another experiment to define a ROI and then go cherry pick.
Yeah, but the question is whether that is necessary. I mean,
Well, it is necessary if you're going to prove that the model you're using is capturing the things that you claim, the processes that you claim, right?
right, but these areas are not selected based on anything related to the model. They're selected based on responding to reward more than to no reward. That is equally consistent with the standard reinforced learning model and with the Moody reinforced learning model. It shouldn't bias the signal to look to be more likely to be explainable by this model. There's no reason to think that the effect of mood is in any way related to the selection procedure. So if you want to say that maybe...
I actually disagree with you.
All right.
So if you want this to make a claim for reward across contexts, then the fact that you're using the same task in which you're defining the mood momentum parameter to generate a response, which does or doesn't correct, but now you're going to pick it to pick the ROI, that is a little self-defeating in a way. I don't agree with your argument. So while I agree with you, this meta level of, I have no reason to think that what you're calling mood should affect this here. But you need an independent measure of that to be convinced.
Right.
For a science experiment, no?
The question of whether the effect of mood generalizes across contexts, that is another question.
In your case, reward. So what you're claiming is that the invariant here is reward response.
Yeah.
Generalizing across something that has a mood component or is taking into account something that doesn't. Okay. No. I'm just thinking of reviewers that hack on me. If I said, when I have said, we're using this, we're going to winnow down on this striatum, and the claim is, oh, well, you didn't have an independent reason to pick that. You use your task yourself to sort of, you must be different. Pardon? Striatum's what?
Even without the task, I can see that a priori an ROI would be very...
This is an ROI defined by the response to the task itself. It's a different task. That's what my, take it as a model play.
All right. Okay.
These are blunt tasks. They're low dimensional. In the world of an animal's experience.
Yeah.
Where you might define reward. And certainly in what you would almost say, although you and I haven't talked about that, you would define as mood, which is certainly integrating over a whole bunch of stuff.
Yep.
Okay. This is a low dimensional representation. There are ways in which it can fool you. Right? Lots of stuff projected on the computer. But that's, I'm just...
All right. So now that I have now that we have this model, we can simulate it and see what happens over a longer period of time. So what I'm doing here is simulating an extremely stable state environment, which is the only thing that happens here is that the model gets a repeated outcome of 10 for 300 iterations. You can think about it as if like you're getting a salary. And in the beginning, this outcome is surprising to the model. This is the standard reinforced learning model, no mood yet. So in the beginning, the outcome is surprising for the model, but then it gradually updates its expectation to the correct level. So then it stops being surprised and nothing else happens. Now, what happens when I expose the moody reinforced learning model to the same environment is completely different. So what we see here is that the model essentially fails to converge. It keeps oscillating between overly optimistic and overly pessimistic expectations and good mood and bad mood. So what's happening here? What's happening is that when the model is positively surprised, its moods become higher, and then its reward perception becomes higher, and then that makes it even more positively surprised, and that makes it even more happy, and so on. And throughout this process, because the reward is being perceived as larger than it really is, then the model generates overly high expectations. Now, once this process converges, and the expectations catch up with what is being perceived, there are no longer positive surprises. The mood goes down towards neutral, but the changes in expectations is always lagging. So what happens is that once we get to this neutral mood, we still have two overly high expectations, and that sets up the stage for negative surprises and the negative escalation part of the cycle. During this negative escalation, the model builds up overly low expectation, and that sets up the stage for positive surprises and positive escalations again. So we think that this could be a model that can explain why some people's mood tend to fluctuate between extremes, where good mood spontaneously follows bad mood, and bad mood spontaneously follows good mood. And there are two groups, one at UCL and one at Princeton, that are planning to test this in the lab in bipolar patients. So just to sum up what I told you about today, I told you about that I showed you that changes in people's mood are preceded by changes in the way that they respond to rewards. And this predictive relationship is characterized by multiple timescales in reward learning with fast and slow processes. I showed you that in some people, reward doesn't only affect mood, but mood also affects the way that they respond to reward. And this is specifically evident in people who tend to be emotionally unstable. And it's also reflected in their striatal reward prediction error signals. We then developed a normative theory of mood that explains why we should have mood to begin with. But we also saw that the same system with particular parameterizations can lead to emotional instability. I don't have much time left, do I?
Yeah, sure. We started a little late.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So,
People can just, I mean, we started at 4 hours.
mm-hmm. All right. So I want to say a few words about. So I have other lines of study that I worked on. I'm going to actually skip that and talk a little bit about my future plans. And my most concrete plan has to do with the work that I presented to you today. And the main goal here would be to test whether this process actually explains escalations and oscillations in mood in people by using the mobile platform that I presented you in the first half of the talk to test the theory that I presented you in the second half of the talk. And what I would need for that is essentially just a larger sample of people with having some people that are more, tend to be more emotionally unstable, and some people that are less more emotionally stable. The second goal of this project would be to study the neural circuits responsible for these mood trends. There are a lot of fMRI studies about mood, but most of them tend to look at mood as if it's a static measure. So either they compare healthy patients with healthy control with patients with depression, or they compare people with bad mood and people with good mood. But I think a lot of what we see in these studies is actually the effects of mood as opposed to what is driving mood to begin with. So a more insightful comparison could be between people whose mood is currently going down and people whose mood is currently going up. So by combining the large dual data collections on the phone with fMRI sessions in the lab, I will be able to analyze the fMRI data in the context of the longer-term process that people are measuring, the longer-term process that I'm measuring behaviorally. Another goal that I'm going to test using the same setup is I'm going to study the effects of mood on learning and consolidation and how these are reflected in neural responses to stimuli that people that learned about on the app in the previous week. So I can look at stimuli that people learned about when they're in a bad mood and stimuli that people learned about in a good mood, and also look at the time in between to assess potential processes of consolidation taking place. More generally, I'm planning to continue and develop the mobile phone platform with different types of tasks and with different types of sensors. So far I showed you how I can use it to measure the rate at which people gather information, but also the rate at which people forget information. We saw a little bit of evidence of a consolidation process, and we separated between fast and slow processes. In the future, I may also look at processes that learn about second-order statistics of the data, such as volatility or stability. So everything that we talked about today had to do with processes learned by reward, but the same considerations apply to processes learned about punishment, episodic and spatial information, semantic information, motor skills, perceptual learning. Obviously, all of these things today are studied in the lab, but using the mobile platform, I will be able to study them, their long-term dynamics, how they interact with one another, and most importantly, how they interact with other aspects of people's mental state and the things that happen in their life during this time. So today we looked at this particular element, but in the near future, I'm also interested in looking at how people respond to, how people learn about negative outcomes, and how that interacts with their level of anxiety and physiological arousal, which I could measure using the wearable sensors, and the way that they attend to information and generalize between different sources of negative outcomes. We know that there are relationships between these two things, but the idea would be to study the dynamic evolution of the interaction between them over time, and whether it explains people's fluctuating levels of anxiety and arousal. I will complement studying these long-term dynamical processes with studying individual differences in brain structure and function in the lab. I'm also interested in particular neurobiological hypotheses underlying the process that I talked to you about today. That could be studied potentially in humans, but also through collaboration in animal models. The work I presented to you today has natural implications for mood disorders. So I also want to extend my work to these kind of populations. And finally, I want to say that I think that progressing in all of these different directions, we can gradually come to understand how differences in people's cognitive functions relate to their underlie their differences in their real life behavior, and that in the long term I think could lead to what I like to call a computational theory of personality, which would be unlike current theories. It would be based on objective measures of traits. It will be linked to the underlying neural substrate and will redefine the way that we think about personality in algorithmic terms. And finally, I'd like to thank my mentors and collaborators, and in particular the people that took part, contributed to the work that I presented to you today, Yael Niv, and Peter Dayan, Ray Dolan, and Charlotte Ra. And thank you for listening.
I'd like to ask the first question, and then I'm going to cut over to the video, because we always forget that cut the video people being streamed to the other campus. At the end, you said something about looking for the neural circuit implementation of these effects that you're saying.
Yeah.
Do you entertain the possibility that this is something that goes on at a very granular level throughout the nervous system, and might relate to basic physiological things like energy balance or energy charge, or the way a circuit could be used and whatnot? In other words, synapses and intracellular cascades are adapting all over the brain. That gets integrated over, and there's a sort of mood readout, as it were. Or do you see it as a specific circuit? You had one of your goals was going after this.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, your first suggestion sounds completely reasonable and valid. It's possible that it's a distributed, the changes in mood are implemented in a very distributed way, such as what you're suggesting. But I think that there is a chance that we may be able to localize some aspects of this process in a more specific way. In particular, I think I'm interested. I think that serotonin specifically forms a very appealing candidate for mediating the effect of mood on responsivity to reward, and that is because of two lines of evidence. One is we know from clinical work that, obviously that serotonergic drugs impact mood disorders. And the other one is that in the last couple of years, there has been work both in humans and in animals showing that serotonin, increased serotonin, is associated with greater learning from rewards. And that was tested both with serotonergic drugs and with the opposite, with tryptophan depletion. So both of, putting two and two together, that makes serotonin as an ideal candidate to mediate this impact. And right now I'm collaborating on testing this in humans using serotonergic drugs. But I think ultimately we need more specific measurements to be able to get it done.
Who's left on the video? I don't know if you guys can see me.
This is Geeti. I will talk to him tomorrow.
Okay, thanks.
I'm here, Sujith. I have more of a thought slash just probe your thoughts on it. You know, I see the world through sleepy eyes, and so one thought I had is that of within subject manipulation, right? So when subjects are sleep deprived, their emotional regulation and mood becomes a lot more volatile, right? So if you thought about, you know, in these mood assessments, looking at subjects that are sleep deprived, and also, you know, if you have these mobile apps, they're pretty good at measuring a night's sleep. So you could try to correlate, you know, the amount of sleep they got or deprivation of it to their performance on these tasks.
Sound like Sujith, you froze, so we're going to treat that like it was the end of the question. Oh wait, there you go.
I couldn't hear anything. What happened?
Sorry, you froze. We lost you for a minute. You were
Oh,
going
okay.
to go to sleep. You fell asleep, I think.
I said, I see that, you know, so that the thing is that you could do a within subject manipulation in the sense that if you're sleep deprived or have their emotional regulation is disrupted, right? They're more moody in a sense, right?
Uh-huh.
So have you thought about doing these metrics, you know, with sleep deprivation? And another thought is that since you have the mobile app, right, that'll give a pretty good measure of how much they sleep, or their app tell you that. Then you could look at, once again, you could look at the correlation of how much sleep they had or they didn't have
Right.
on some of these mood metrics that you're doing.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I lost you again.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Yeah, I was just saying that makes perfect sense, and it would be very interesting to measure. There is also another line of evidence from people who generally work about emotion regulation, and it seems that emotion regulation is an ability. The people differ from one another in how well they can regulate their own emotions. And that these kind of biases that I work on, I think, are likely to be weaker in people who have better ability to regulate their own emotions. But so the idea with sleep, I think, is consistent with that. Yep. Sorry, I Right. Yeah, so yeah. Right. I think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered in this respect. So one thing that I was thinking about is, well, so I use the gold standard for assessing mood is simply to ask people how do you feel, but it could be that at some point in the future we will realize that there are actually objective measures that are better. And the way to do that is, well, we first need to characterize what are the effects of mood, and then we can see, we can like, we can design models of how, of the dynamics of mood. And then we can see, well, so do people's subjective responses fit better to this model or some other objective measures? So as I work with this mobile platform, I will, like, even without aiming to do that, I'm going to collect a lot of data about mood and all sorts of physiological responses and sleeping patterns and motor activity and so on. And I will be able to derive an objective measures of mood from that. And ultimately, in the long term, that could actually, in the end, replace the subjective report.
Could I follow up on that? I thought you were going to ask something slightly different. So this is a very cool approach that sort of takes a low-dimensional thing that we all do in the laboratory and puts it into the field and lets people walk around. I mean, I know you've only done, like...
Only 10 subjects for a week.
Okay, but I mean, you'll get to thousands, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And yet these companies that own our data, that sell us phones and things like that, are rapidly accruing giant databases in the wild. And they will accidentally have all the dimensions that you measure, plus a bunch of others that we may not have thought of yet. Do you worry, this is a little bit of a meta question, I thought you were going to say, do you worry that you're going to miss the real meat, because you have to kind of commit to the things that you're looking at a priori, whereas these guys have a billion people, and they find dimensions that you haven't really, none of us have ever thought of.
I think these are two complementary
Except they're not going to give it to you. They're not going to call you up and say, oh, hey, by the way, we have this, what you should do in the lab is X.
That's true, but, if the...
This affects all our lives. Anybody that has a behavioral component in what they're looking for, whether or not we use a brain component, Google will have more data on anything you could ask about a human, and across more humans than we could even dream of.
Yeah, but the question is whether you still think there's room, given that, whether you still think that there is room for directed hypothesis-driven designed experiments. And I think that there is definitely at this point in time. Maybe, it's some...
Well, it's harder than that on us, isn't it? They have a mountain of data. They can come up with a very low-dimensional hypothesis and go hunting through all these elements of people's behavior that we would never even have access to. It's a worry. I mean, it's a thought. It certainly occurs to me. I don't know any other way than doing a low-dimensional hypothesis-driven experiment. I don't know any other way to do science, and so I'm going to have to survive with that. It's like another form of life that's happened, and I'm going to have to figure out how to stay alive. But it doesn't seem unreasonable to think that they're going to stumble on things that we haven't thought of.
To me, that's I'm not particularly worried. I'm excited about that option. I don't think things are going to get resolved that quickly because you need will and you need an informed theoretical approach to even begin to think about this kind of thing. So I think if it does happen, it will probably happen by involving some cognitive neuroscientists in those data.
Okay. Well, let's thank the speaker again. Thanks for your time.